What if I told you that the reason your last major pitch at work completely failed, or the reason that high-stakes negotiation with your contractor just went entirely off the rails is actually the exact same reason an Athenian politician was exiled like 2.5 millennia ago?
I mean, it's a wildly humbling realization.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
We tend to think that because we have, smartphones and artificial intelligence, the fundamental architecture of human persuasion has somehow evolved.
Right.
But it really hasn't. The human animal is still operating on the exact same psychological hardware it was in, 400 BCE?
Yeah, exactly. And we constantly build these meticulously logical arguments, complete with, data sets and pivot tables, and then we are just completely baffled when the person sitting across from us flat out rejects our conclusion.
Right. We just assume human beings are rational, calculating machines.
We do. And when the machine doesn't output the logical result, we just assume the machine is broken.
Or we assume the other person is just being, intentionally difficult. Well, welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up an absolute masterclass on human behavior for you.
We really are.
We are looking at a comprehensive commentary and analysis of one of the most foundational frameworks for human communication ever devised, which is Aristotle's Rhetoric.
Yeah, and to be clear, right from the jump, we are not looking at this as some dry history lesson.
No, not at all. We are tearing this ancient playbook down to its studs to understand the actual physics of persuasion.
Because we want to know how to connect this theoretical architecture directly to your daily reality.
Exactly. How to spot the hidden fallacies in the arguments used against you every single day, and, how to fundamentally restructure your own approach to personal and professional negotiations.
But to do that effectively, I think we first have to strip away the modern baggage associated with the word rhetoric.
Right, because today, if a politician gives a speech we don't like, we immediately dismiss it as, just empty rhetoric.
Yeah, we equate the word with deception or spin or just outright manipulation. But for Aristotle, rhetoric was completely neutral.
It was just a tool, right?
Exactly. He defined it simply as the faculty of observing, in any given case, the available means of persuasion.
Okay, so just spotting the levers you can pull.
Right. It was the practical, messy counterpart to dialectic, which is, strict philosophical logic. Aristotle wasn't interested in how humans ought to make decisions in some perfect utopian society.
He was observing how they actually make decisions in the chaotic reality of the public square.
Precisely. He was ruthlessly pragmatic.
Well, okay, let's unpack this and start exactly there with that chaotic reality, because he didn't write this framework in a vacuum.
No, he didn't.
He was deeply frustrated with the quote-unquote experts of his own time, wasn't he? He looked at the communication manuals being sold by his contemporaries and thought they were just completely missing the point.
Oh, he was highly critical of them. The writers he was reacting against, they're often associated with the sophists. They were essentially the PR spin doctors of ancient Greece.
Right.
In the Athenian system, any citizen could be dragged into court and forced to defend themselves before a jury of literally hundreds of their peers.
Wow. So there was obviously a massive market for manuals on how to win a court case.
A huge market. But Aristotle noticed this glaring flaw in these manuals. They focused almost exclusively on what he called warping the judge.
Warping the judge. Meaning, they were just teaching people how to play the emotional keyboard.
That's exactly it. Their entire strategy relied on inciting hostility or pity or blinding anger in the jury.
Just bypassing the brain entirely.
Yeah, they completely ignored the actual facts of the case, the logical proof, or the actual substance of the argument.
Because they figured if you could make the jury angry enough at your opponent, the facts simply wouldn't matter.
Right, and Aristotle viewed this as fundamentally corrupting. He argued that allowing emotional manipulation to entirely replace the evidence is like a carpenter purposefully using a warped ruler to measure a piece of wood.
Oh, that's a great analogy. But I'm going to challenge that right away.
Yeah.
Because if we look at the modern landscape, cable news, political campaigns, social media algorithms, it seems like the sophists actually won.
It does seem that way, doesn't it?
Yeah. That strategy of warping the judge by triggering outrage is wildly effective. So was Aristotle just being, an idealist?
It's a really fair challenge, and I think it's exactly why his framework is so crucial for us today. Aristotle didn't deny that emotional manipulation works in the short term, especially on a large crowd.
Right, he wasn't blind to reality.
Exactly, but he recognized it as a highly unstable, incomplete form of persuasion. I mean, it relies entirely on the audience's volatility.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
Meaning, if you build your entire case on anger and the audience suddenly gets tired or distracted or a different speaker gets up and makes them laugh, your entire argument just evaporates.
Oh, wow. Because there is no structural foundation underneath it.
Precisely. It's a house of cards.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And for you listening, this is really your first real tool for spotting weak arguments in your own daily life. When you are in a debate, whether it's like a tense board meeting or just a neighborhood association dispute, and the other person completely abandons the timeline of events or the data.
And they suddenly make it entirely about how you have insulted their integrity or how outrageous the situation is.
Right. They are using this incomplete rhetoric. A clear sign of a failing argument or a logical fallacy is when the emotional appeal doesn't support the evidence, but desperately tries to replace the evidence.
Exactly. They are trying to hide an incredibly weak case behind a thick emotional smokescreen.
So how do we counter that?
Well, to counter this, Aristotle built a complete system arguing that true, stable persuasion requires three pillars to be perfectly balanced.
The famous three pillars.
Right. Ethos, pathos, and logos.
Okay, break those down for us.
So logos is the logic and the reasoning within the argument itself. Pathos is the emotional disposition of the audience. And ethos is the character and credibility of the speaker.
Let's pause on ethos for a second, actually, because I think people completely misunderstand what credibility means in an argument today.
How so?
Well, we tend to think ethos means your resume. You know, you have a PhD or you are the vice president of sales. Therefore, you automatically have ethos.
Oh, right.
But in practice, you can have a brilliant expert stand up in a room and within 5 minutes, nobody believes a single word they say.
That is such a vital distinction. Aristotle was very clear that ethos is not about your pre-existing titles or your reputation before you even open your mouth.
It's not.
No. True ethos is constructed during the speech itself.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It is the audience's real-time perception of three very specific things: your practical wisdom, your virtue, and your goodwill toward them.
Goodwill. That feels like the linchpin right there.
It absolutely is. You can be the foremost expert on a topic, but if the audience senses that you are condescending to them or that you have some hidden selfish agenda...
Meaning you lack goodwill.
Exactly. If they sense that, your ethos is instantly shattered. And once ethos is shattered, the audience's brain essentially turns off the receiver.
They just stop listening.
Yep.
They will not process your logos, no matter how good the data is.
I always think of persuasion like a three-legged stool. If you have all the facts, your logos, but your audience thinks you're untrustworthy, so you have no ethos, or they are incredibly angry, which is bad pathos, the stool just falls over.
That's a perfect analogy. You need all three to keep the argument upright.
Okay, so it's not enough to just be right. You have to be perceived as someone who is safe and actually beneficial to listen to.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the actual logic part, the logos. If we establish that we are credible and we need to present a logical argument, how do we do that without sounding like a completely unhinged academic?
What do you mean by unhinged academic?
Well, you know, in strict philosophy, you use a syllogism, right? Like, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Right, the classic syllogism.
But if I walk into a salary negotiation with my boss and start talking in strict logical premises like that, I'm going to be escorted out of the building. Yeah, you definitely are. And Aristotle completely understood that. Strict scientific logic requires absolute certainty. It deals in undeniable truths.
And real life is messy.
Extremely messy. Human affairs, politics, negotiations, they don't deal in absolute certainties.
Yeah.
We operate in the realm of probabilities, likelihoods, and just wildly unpredictable human behavior.
So what's the solution?
Well, Aristotle identified a specific tool designed exactly for this murky landscape. It's called the enthymeme.
The enthymeme.
Oh.
Okay, I know from the commentary we're studying that this is arguably the most powerful weapon in the entire rhetorical arsenal.
Without a doubt.
Break down exactly how this works for us.
Simply put, an enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism where one of the premises is intentionally left unstated.
Intentionally left unstated. Why?
Because it relies on the audience's common knowledge, their shared values, or even their prejudices to fill in the blank.
Okay, I need a concrete example of how this plays out in real life.
Sure. Let's look at a typical corporate environment. Imagine a company is struggling, and a board member says, "We need a CEO who actually understands the engineering of our core product, so we should hire Sarah."
Okay, sounds like a normal suggestion.
On the surface, yeah, it sounds like a simple, logical statement. But it's actually an enthymeme. What is the hidden, unstated premise there?
Well, the unstated premise is that the current CEO does not understand the engineering.
Exactly. The board member never actually said, our current CEO is technically incompetent.
Oh, wow. Right.
But by stating the enthymeme, they forced everyone else in the room to supply that exact premise in their own minds in order to make the logic work.
The psychological mechanics of that are just staggering. Because think about it. If the board member had openly attacked the current CEO, people might have gotten defensive.
Absolutely. They might have pushed back and demanded actual proof of the CEO's incompetence.
But by leaving it unsaid, by forcing the listeners to connect the dots themselves, it feels like a personal realization rather than an aggressive accusation.
Yes. The audience gets a tiny little dopamine hit of figuring out the puzzle. And in doing so, they become active co-creators of the argument.
It feels like their idea.
That is the absolute genius of the enthymeme. Persuasion is always infinitely more powerful when the audience believes they arrived at the conclusion themselves.
You aren't dragging them to your destination.
No, you are just paving the road and letting them drive the car.
You know, it reminds me of everyday life, too. You don't tell your partner, all humans need sleep. You're human, therefore you need sleep.
Right.
You just say, you look exhausted, go to bed. And their brain fills in the rest.
Exactly. We use them all the time without realizing it.
But wait, if we look at this critically, isn't this incredibly dangerous?
Oh, extremely.
Because if an enthymeme relies on the audience's unstated assumptions, aren't we just essentially weaponizing their existing prejudices?
You've hit on the exact vulnerability of the system.
I mean, it sounds like a highly sophisticated academic term for a dog whistle. You just allude to a bias the crowd already holds, let them fill in the blank with their own prejudice, and ride that to victory without ever having to explicitly state something toxic out loud.
Yes, enthymemes are the primary vehicle for demagoguery and manipulation precisely because they allow a speaker to rely on false or toxic premises without having to actually defend them.
That is terrifying.
It is. But Aristotle recognized that rhetoric, like any powerful tool, is completely morally neutral.
Right.
A scalpel can save a life in the hands of a surgeon, or it can take a life in the hands of an assassin. The enthymeme is just the mechanical mechanism of persuasion.
Which means the best defense against it is just sheer awareness.
Awareness is everything.
If you are sitting in a meeting or watching a debate and you feel yourself nodding along to a statement that seems incredibly persuasive but maybe slightly off, you have to train your brain to just hit the pause button.
Yes. You have to ask yourself, what is the hidden assumption they are relying on me to agree with?
Identifying that unstated premise really is the skeleton key. Because if you drag that hidden premise out into the light, you realize it's fundamentally flawed or entirely biased, the entire argument just instantly collapses.
That right there is the highest level of critical listening. You stop evaluating just what is being said, and you start ruthlessly evaluating what is being omitted.
All right, so we have our primary tool, the enthymeme, and we understand the pillars of credibility and logic. But a tool is only effective if you know the environment you are operating in.
That's true.
One of the most fascinating distinctions in this entire commentary is the idea that all human communication basically takes place in one of three specific arenas or genres of speech.
Yes, Aristotle categorized all rhetoric into three distinct genres based entirely on the timeline of the argument and the role of the audience.
Okay, timeline. Tell me about the first one.
The first is the judicial genre. This is the rhetoric of the courtroom. It deals exclusively with the past.
The past. Okay.
Its entire goal is to determine what is just or unjust, and it involves accusing someone or defending someone based on events that have already happened.
So literally like, who stole the money or who broke the contract?
Exactly. Accusation and defense. The second is the epideictic genre, which is often translated as ceremonial rhetoric.
Ceremonial.
Right. This deals with the present. Its focus is on praising or blaming someone or something, and its core values are honor or disgrace. Think of, a eulogy, a graduation speech, or even a company's mission statement.
Okay, I want to push back a little on the epideictic genre being labeled just ceremonial, because that makes it sound like totally optional fluff.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. It makes it sound like the speeches people give before the open bar starts at a wedding. But isn't it actually doing some heavy lifting behind the scenes?
Oh, it absolutely is. And it's a genre that modern professionals vastly underestimate. Epideic rhetoric isn't just about making people feel warm and fuzzy.
What is it doing then?
It is the primary mechanism by which a community or an organization establishes its shared values.
Oh, interesting.
When a CEO gives a speech praising a specific team for their relentless innovation, they aren't just tossing out compliments. They are actively defining what the company honors in the present moment.
They are calibrating the moral compass of the audience.
Exactly. And you need those shared values firmly established before you can ever ask that audience to take action in the future.
Which perfectly sets up the third genre.
Yes, the deliberative genre. This deals entirely with the future.
The future.
It is the rhetoric of the assembly, the boardroom, or the strategic planning committee. Its focus is on advising for or against a specific action based on what will be useful, beneficial, or harmful moving forward.
Okay, this right here is the absolute biggest aha moment for practical, everyday application.
I agree completely.
Because if you analyze most failed personal or professional negotiations,
Yeah.
they fail because the two parties are unknowingly operating in completely different genres of speech.
Oh, all the time.
Think about a major crisis at work. Let's say a critical server crashes, the website goes down, and thousands of dollars are being lost by the minute. The team gets pulled into a conference room. Immediately, the project manager starts operating in the judicial genre.
Locked entirely in the past.
Right. They are locked in the past. They say, who pushed the bad code? The QA team didn't run the right tests. You failed your responsibility. They are acting exactly like a prosecutor in a courtroom.
And what is the immediate biological result of a judicial accusation? Defensiveness.
Instantly.
The QA team immediately starts defending their past actions, the engineers start blaming the server hosts, and everyone gets locked in this adversarial battle over historical facts, which are incredibly difficult to prove in the heat of the moment anyway.
The entire meeting just becomes a quest to assign blame rather than actually solve the problem.
It's a massive waste of time.
Exactly. But if you apply this framework, you realize you have the power to fundamentally change the rules of engagement just by shifting the timeline. You intervene, and you forcefully pull the negotiation out of the judicial past and into the deliberative future.
Yes.
You say, listen, we can audit the testing process next week.
Right.
Right now, what is our immediate path to getting the server back online within the hour, and what resources do the engineers need to do it?
It's brilliant. You shift the core value from who is just or unjust in the past to what is useful or harmful in the future. It is a profound pivot. Aristotle actually considered deliberative rhetoric to be the most noble of the three genres, precisely because it moves away from individual grievances and narrow legal defenses and forces the participants to focus on shared utility and mutual benefit.
Wow.
When you shift a tense argument to the deliberative genre, you stop sitting across from your opponent like a prosecutor, and you start sitting next to them looking together at a shared problem in the future.
It totally diffuses the tension. I mean, even at home, if you're fighting about chores, staying in the judicial past like, you didn't do the dishes yesterday, you are unjust, just leads to a fight.
Oh.
Shifting to deliberative, how can we organize the chores tomorrow so we both have more free time? Totally changes the game.
It's a masterclass in applied rhetoric.
But, okay, let's look at the reality of that boardroom or that kitchen. You can make the most brilliant, deliberative pivot. You can use perfect logic. Your enthymemes can be flawless.
Sure.
But if the lead engineer or your spouse is sitting there with their arms crossed, absolutely furious that their competence was questioned, they aren't going to hear a single word of your forward-looking strategy.
No, they won't. The logic will simply bounce off of them.
Which brings us back to Pathos. How does Aristotle suggest we handle an audience that is hijacked by irrational emotion?
Well, the first thing Aristotle does is completely reframe the premise of your question. He doesn't view these emotions as irrational at all.
Really?
No. He views them as highly logical, highly predictable responses to specific stimuli. He catalogs human emotion with the precision of an evolutionary biologist.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's take anger, for example. We tend to think of anger as a sudden, uncontrollable eruption. But Aristotle defines anger very specifically. He says it is a desire accompanied by pain for perceived revenge caused by a perceived slight or belittling that was directed at you or someone you care about when that slight was completely unjustified.
Man, that is incredibly specific. It's like an equation.
It is an equation.
Pain plus desire for revenge, triggered by a loss of status or an unjustified slight.
Exactly. And he even breaks down slighting into three distinct categories: contempt, spite, and insult.
Okay, define those for us.
Contempt is when someone treats things that are important to you as if they're completely worthless. Spite is when someone thwarts your desires not to get anything for themselves, but simply to stop you from having it.
Oh, that is infuriating.
Right. And insult is when someone causes you shame merely for the pleasure of feeling superior to you.
This maps so perfectly onto our modern psychology. Think about the examples used in the commentary to illustrate this. Like, why do we get so incredibly furious when someone forgets our name?
Oh, it's the worst.
It's not just a minor inconvenience, you know?
Yeah.
It stings. It burns. Because according to this framework, forgetting someone's name is a demonstration of contempt.
Yes.
It essentially signals to the other person, you are of such little value to my life and my status that my brain didn't even bother to allocate the caloric energy required to store your identity.
It is a profound, if accidental, belittling.
And this extends to how we communicate during a conflict, too. Aristotle explicitly points out the extreme danger of using irony or sarcasm when the other person is being earnest.
This is such a critical point.
I see this constantly in negotiations, or even just arguments between partners. Someone is genuinely hurt, they're expressing a real vulnerability, and the other person deploys a sarcastic quip to score, like a cheap intellectual point.
And the negotiation instantly detonates.
Boom, done.
Because sarcasm in that specific context is the ultimate form of insult. The other person has lowered their shield to be earnest, and you respond by mocking their sincerity to demonstrate your own cleverness.
It completely strips them of their dignity.
Exactly. According to Aristotle's mechanism, you haven't just annoyed them, you have actively inflicted social pain upon them. And that mathematically guarantees that their brain will generate anger and a desire for revenge.
So the practical takeaway here isn't just, be nice.
No, it's much more strategic than that.
The takeaway is that if you use sarcasm in a tense negotiation, you are actively sabotaging your own logos. You are pouring sand right into the gears of the negotiation engine.
Precisely. And this mechanical understanding applies to other emotions like shame, too. Aristotle links shame directly to our reputation and our social capital.
How so?
He says shame is pain concerning a loss of status in the eyes of the people we actually respect. We don't feel shame in front of people we hold in contempt.
Oh, right. We don't care what they think.
Exactly. We feel it in front of our mentors, our peers, our rivals. Evolutionarily, losing social status in a tribe meant exile and death. So the physical sensation of shame is intensely powerful.
Okay, so if I'm in that boardroom and I realize the lead engineer is absolutely furious because the project manager's earlier comment accidentally triggered their shame. Let's say the PM questioned their testing protocols in front of the junior developers, causing a massive loss of social capital.
What is my rhetorical move? I mean, I can't just throw an enthymeme at them.
No, you cannot. You have to repair the emotional leg of the stool first.
So I have to use my ethos to soothe their pathos.
Yes. If you know their anger is caused by a perceived slight, a loss of status, your first move must be to publicly restore that status.
So I explicitly acknowledge their expertise.
Exactly. You validate the difficulty of their work. You demonstrate to the whole room that you hold them in high regard. Once you remove the perception of the slight, the anger mechanically begins to dissipate.
Because the tribe has been removed.
Right. And only then do you pivot to the deliberative future.
That is structural empathy. You aren't just giving them a hug to be nice, you are actively diagnosing the psychological blockage and clearing it so the logic can flow again.
It's engineering for emotions. Now, I want to pivot to a completely different kind of blockage. Because sometimes you do everything right. Your ethos is great, you manage the pathos beautifully, your deliberative logic is super sound.
Okay.
But you are locked in a dispute where the strict, literal rules of the game are simply rigged against you. You signed a contract, and technically, by the absolute letter of the law, you are in the wrong.
It happens all the time.
Does this framework offer any kind of escape hatch for when the written rules are actually designed to defeat you?
It does, and it's honestly one of the most sophisticated legal and ethical arguments in the entire framework. Aristotle recognized that the law is a very blunt instrument.
Blunt in what way?
He makes a crucial distinction between specific written laws, which are compulsory and rigid, and general unwritten laws, which are based on universal human concepts of fairness and justice.
And this unwritten universal fairness is what he calls equity.
Yes, equity.
Let's define the actual mechanics of equity, because it sounds a bit like just whining that something isn't fair.
It's much more rigorous than that. Think of it structurally. A legislator or a contract writer has to create a rule that applies universally to everyone.
Right.
But human life is infinitely complex. They cannot possibly foresee every single messy, nuanced, unique human situation that might arise. So they write a rigid rule based on the typical scenario.
Okay, that makes sense.
Equity is the principle that steps in when applying that rigid, typical rule to an atypical situation would actually result in a profound injustice.
So equity doesn't destroy the law.
No, equity fulfills the spirit of the law when the letter of the law completely fails.
I want to use a creative metaphor here to make sure this really clicks for you listening. Think of the written law as the rigid metal frame of a car.
Okay, like this.
It provides structure, it holds everything together, and it is absolutely necessary. But if you drive a rigid metal frame over a massive blot hole, which represents a uniquely messy human situation, that rigid frame will just snap under the pressure.
Right.
Equity acts as the shock absorbers. The shock absorbers temporarily flex and bend to absorb the anomaly, ensuring that the entire vehicle doesn't break apart.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Equity is the necessary flexibility that keeps the system of justice from shattering itself.
So how do we actually deploy this in a real negotiation? Let's say I'm an independent contractor. I have a strict contract that says if I miss a project deadline by even 1 minute, I forfeit 20% of my fee.
Ouch. Okay.
The deadline is midnight. At 11:30 p.m., my city experiences a massive, totally unpredicted power grid failure. I can't upload the files until 8:00 a.m. the next day.
Right.
Technically, according to the rigid metal frame of the written contract, I miss a deadline. If I go to my client and try to argue the facts, like, I didn't miss it, I lose, the timestamp says I missed it, what is my rhetorical move here?
You immediately abandon the judicial argument over the facts because you will lose. Instead, you appeal entirely to equity. You acknowledge the written rule, but you argue to the client that the spirit of that penalty clause was to punish laziness or negligence, not to penalize someone for an unforeseeable act of God.
I see.
You argue that enforcing the penalty in this specific, unique context doesn't serve justice. It just results in arbitrary cruelty. You appeal to their common sense and their inherent desire to be a fair person.
But wait, let's flip the boards for a second. What if I am the client?
Okay.
And I have a strict budget, and this contractor being late actually cost me real money, regardless of the power outage? I need to enforce the penalty. If the contractor plays the equity card and begs for the shock absorbers, how do I defend the rigid metal frame without sounding like a completely heartless sociopath?
Well, Aristotle provides the exact counter-argument for that position as well.
Of course he does.
If you must defend the written law against an appeal to equity, you pivot to the integrity of the system as a whole.
How does that work?
You argue that a rule is entirely useless if it is constantly subjected to exceptions based on individual circumstances. You argue that the fairest thing for everyone is predictability.
Predictability.
Right. If we let personal feelings or unforeseen hiccups override a mutually agreed upon standard, contracts become totally meaningless and the entire system of trust collapses.
So you frame the strict adherence to the law not as cruelty, but as the ultimate protection of fairness for all parties involved.
Exactly. It's incredibly powerful.
It's amazing. You can literally restructure reality based on whether you need the shock absorbers or the metal flame in that specific moment. It just shows how deeply contextual persuasion really is.
It really does.
Now, as we enter the final phase of this framework, we really have to talk about aesthetics.
To delivery.
Yeah, we have the psychology, the timeline, the logic, and the legal strategy. But none of that matters if the audience forgets what you said 5 minutes after you leave the room.
Very true.
How does Aristotle suggest we package these arguments so they actually stick in the human brain?
He focuses heavily on the arsenal of expression, particularly the strategic use of maxims, historical examples, and really vivid metaphors.
Let's start with maxims, which are essentially proverbs or general declarative statements about life.
Right. And Aristotle points out something fascinating about human psychology here. People have a deep, almost desperate desire to hear their own private, unarticulated opinions stated publicly as universal truths.
Oh, that is so profoundly true. It's the entire basis of stand-up comedy.
Thanks, so.
The comedian says something we've all secretly thought but never actually said out loud, and the crowd just erupts because they feel so seen.
Yes. When you use a well-timed maxim in an argument, you tap into that exact phenomenon. The framework notes that even uneducated people use maxims constantly because it instantly grants them an air of moral authority.
It takes a specific, messy, localized dispute and elevates it to a timeless, universal truth.
Precisely. You don't just sound like someone arguing over a contract, you sound like a philosopher who is grounded in the entire history of human experience.
But you can't just speak entirely in bumper stickers, obviously. You need examples to anchor the argument.
You do, and Aristotle distinguishes between inventing examples, like fables, and using actual historical events. Historical precedents are devastatingly effective because they serve as tangible proof that what you are proposing is not only possible, but it has actually worked before.
There is a brilliant historical anecdote in the commentary regarding Themistocles and the oracle that perfectly illustrates the power of interpretation and metaphor in a really high-stakes scenario.
It's arguably one of the greatest rhetorical masterstrokes in history.
Set the scene for us.
So, during the Persian Wars, the massive Persian army was marching straight on Athens. The Athenians were completely terrified, so they sent emissaries to the oracle at Delphi to ask how they could be saved.
As one did back then.
Right. And the oracle, in typical cryptic fashion, gave a prophecy that the Athenians would be saved by wooden walls.
Which, if you were a literal thinker, means you should probably go chop down some trees and build a literal wooden fence around the Acropolis.
Exactly, and I'm sure a lot of politicians argued for exactly that.
I bet they did.
But Themistocles realized that a wooden fence would be easily destroyed by the Persian army. He needed to persuade the entire city-state to abandon their homes, take to the sea, and fight a massive naval battle.
A huge ask.
A nearly impossible ask. So he deployed a metaphor. He argued that the wooden walls the oracle spoke of were not a literal fence. They were a fleet of wooden ships.
Wow.
By interpreting the divine prophecy through this specific metaphor, he gave his military strategy the ultimate moral and religious authority. He persuaded the Athenians to build the fleet, they evacuated the city, and they destroyed the Persian navy at the Battle of Salamis.
The metaphor literally served as the mechanism of survival for Western civilization. It wasn't just pretty language. It was the psychological bridge that allowed the people to accept a terrifying new reality.
That's beautifully put.
And there's another historical example in the commentary that is just a lethal use of metaphor. It involves the poet Antiphon and Dionysius, the tyrant of Syracuse.
Yes, this is an incredible, albeit slightly tragic, example of rhetorical strike power. Dionysius was a brutal tyrant who really enjoyed surrounding himself with intellectuals just to make himself look cultured.
Typical tyrant behavior.
Right. So at a banquet, he asks the poet Antiphon, what is the best kind of bronze?
A completely mundane metallurgical question on the surface. But Antiphon knows he's talking to a tyrant. So Antiphon looks at him and replies that the best bronze is the bronze that was used to make the statues of Harmodius and Aristogeiton.
And the context, the unstated premise that everyone in the room instantly understood is that Harmodius and Aristogeiton were the two most famous legendary figures in Athenian history, known entirely for one specific act.
Assassinating a tyrant.
Exactly.
It is an absolute devastating mic drop. He tells a tyrant right to his face, in front of his entire court, that the only good bronze is the bronze used to commemorate men who murder tyrants.
It is a flawless, absolute lethal metaphor.
Now, the commentary does note that Dionysius had Antiphon executed shortly after this. So the lesson here is definitely gauge your audience before you drop a metaphor like that.
Yeah, read the room.
But the underlying mechanism is undeniable. Why do metaphors and historical references hit us so much harder than just, stating the facts?
Because of how they interact with the human brain. A metaphor completely bypasses the analytical, critical faculties and strikes directly at the imagination. As Aristotle explains, effective metaphors put things before the eyes of the listener.
Before the eyes.
Yes. They take abstract, static concepts like justice, danger, or value, and make them active, physical, and visible in the mind. When you say he is a rat, you aren't asking the audience to evaluate a logical list of the person's character flaws.
Right, you aren't giving a PowerPoint presentation.
No, you are forcing their brain to instantly visualize a creature associated with filth, disease, and sneaking around in the dark. It is an immediate, visceral transfer of meaning.
Which really brings us full circle, because we started this whole conversation talking about blueprints and precision engineering, assuming the communication was a clean, logical transfer of data.
Right.
But what we've actually discovered is that persuasion is a deeply human, deeply biological art.
It absolutely is. Well, let's recap the journey we've taken through this framework today. We started by identifying the inherent weakness of pure emotional manipulation, the sophist's strategy of warping the judge, which inevitably fails the moment the emotional high wears off.
Right, the house of cards. And then we discovered the architecture of true credibility, understanding that ethos must be built in real time through perceived practical wisdom and, most importantly, goodwill.
Yes. We unlocked the Enthymeme, the most powerful tool in the arsenal, which works by intentionally omitting a premise so that the audience co-creates the argument and feels total ownership over the conclusion.
We learned the absolute necessity of recognizing which genre of speech you are in and the tactical advantage of shifting a stalled, backward-looking judicial argument into a forward-looking, deliberative pursuit of mutual benefit.
We examined the mechanical triggers of human emotion, realizing that anger and shame are highly predictable responses to a perceived loss of status. Meaning we can soothe that pathos by actively restoring the other person's dignity before we ever introduce our logos.
We mapped the strategic tension between the rigid metal frame of the written law and the shock absorbers of equity.
And finally, we saw how maxims and striking metaphors put concepts before the eyes, completely bypassing the analytical defenses and lodging ideas permanently in the imagination.
It is just a staggering toolkit. It proves that to be a master communicator, you don't just need to know your data. You need to fundamentally understand the wiring of the human being sitting across the table from you.
And that realization leaves us with a final, really profound question to consider. The entire architecture of Aristotle's system, especially the Enthymeme, the use of maxims, and the reliance on common knowledge, is built on leveraging what the audience already believes to be true.
Okay.
You are taking their own premises, their own values, and their own prejudices, and you're using them as the raw materials to construct your argument.
Which means?
Which means when we engage in a deep debate or a high-stakes negotiation or a political campaign today, we have to ask ourselves, are we ever truly changing someone's mind from scratch? Or are we simply holding up a mirror to their own existing beliefs and carefully rearranging the reflection to build the future we want?
Oh, wow. That is a fascinating, slightly terrifying thought to take into your next major negotiation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this ancient playbook provides you with a powerful new lens to view the conversations, the conflicts, and the persuasions happening all around you every single day. Keep questioning, keep analyzing those hidden premises, and we will catch you next time.